I lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a building that was old, but not old enough to be interesting. It was one of those brick apartment buildings from the late 70s. 3 floors, 12 units total, 4 on each floor. The hallways always smelled faintly like laundry detergent, old carpet, and whatever someone was cooking behind their door. My unit was at the far end of the second-floor hallway. I had one neighbor directly across from me, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez. Next to me was a one-bedroom that had been empty for a while. Below me was a young couple with a baby. Above me was a man I rarely saw, but I heard him sometimes walking around late at night. It was not a dangerous place. At least I never thought it was. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the maintenance was inconsistent, but that was about it. I had lived there almost 2 years by the time this happened. I worked a regular office job and kept a regular schedule. I left around 7:30 in the morning, came home around 6, made dinner, watched something, and went to bed. I did not have a roommate. I did not have people over very often. I was not the kind of person who lost things or forgot whether I had locked the door. I know everybody says that, but I mean it. Locking the door was automatic for me. There was the knob lock, which I usually ignored, and the deadbolt, which I always turned before bed. The first time I noticed it unlocked, I assumed I had made a mistake. It was a Tuesday morning. I was leaving for work, holding my coffee in one hand and my bag in the other. I reached for the deadbolt to unlock it, and my fingers just turned through empty motion. It was already unlocked. I stood there for a second, looking at it. Then I turned it back and forth a few times, like I needed to prove to myself that it worked. It did. The door had been shut. The chain was not on because I almost never used it. Nothing inside looked disturbed. I checked my wallet on the table by the kitchen. My laptop was on the desk. My keys were hanging on the little hook near the door. My TV was still there. Nothing was missing. I told myself I had just forgotten. That explanation bothered me more than it should have, but I accepted it. That night, I made a point of locking the deadbolt. I remember doing it. I even said it out loud. Locked. I felt stupid saying it, but it helped. The next morning, it was locked. For about a week, everything was normal. Then it happened again. This time it was a Monday. I had been out late the night before at my brother's house watching a game. I came home tired, locked the door, and went to bed. In the morning, the deadbolt was unlocked. Again, nothing was missing. I checked drawers. I checked the closet. I checked under the bed, even though I felt ridiculous doing it in broad daylight. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. No open windows. No broken latch. No marks on the door. I went to work, but I thought about it all day. When I got home, I looked closer at the lock. The deadbolt was the original one that had been on the door when I moved in. Brass finish, scratched around the keyhole, slightly loose. I called my landlord, and he told me he could have maintenance take a look later in the week. I did not want to wait, so I went to a hardware store that evening and bought a new deadbolt. Nothing fancy. Just a standard single-cylinder lock, but it came with new keys, and I installed it myself. It took me about an hour because the door frame was a little crooked, and I had to adjust the strike plate. When it finally clicked into place, I felt better. That night, I locked the new deadbolt. I tested it 3 times. The next morning, it was locked. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. I started to feel embarrassed about how much I had worried. Then one morning, I woke up before my alarm. It was still dark outside. I did not know why I was awake at first. There had been no loud noise, no crash, no voice. Just that feeling you get when something small has pulled you out of sleep. I lay there, listening. The apartment was quiet. The heater clicked on. A car passed outside. After a while, I got up to use the bathroom. On my way back to the bedroom, I glanced at the front door. The deadbolt was unlocked. I remember feeling cold in my stomach before I even touched it. It was pointing straight up, in the unlocked position. The door itself was shut. I walked over slowly and turned the deadbolt back into place. It moved smoothly. There was no resistance, no sign that it had been forced. I turned on every light in the apartment. Then I checked everything again. The living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom closet, the coat closet by the front door. Nothing, but this time, I noticed something I had not noticed before. The coat closet smelled different. Not bad exactly, just stale. Like dust, old drywall, and cold air. I kept coats in there, a small vacuum, and a plastic bin of winter stuff. There was nothing unusual that I could see. The back wall of the closet was a panel of cheap, painted plywood. It had always been there, and I had never thought much about it. I pushed on it, but it did not move. At least not then. I did not sleep again that morning. I called the landlord as soon as the office opened and told him the new deadbolt had been unlocked while I was sleeping. He asked if I was sure I had locked it. I told him yes. He asked if I had given a key to anyone. I told him no. He said he would send maintenance to check the door. Maintenance came that afternoon. The guy's name was Rick. I had seen him around the building before. He was in his 50s, quiet, and seemed tired more than anything else. He checked the door, the frame, the new lock, and the hinges. He said everything looked fine. I asked if there were master keys. He said yes, management had a key for every unit, but that those were kept in a lockbox in the office. He said nobody should be using them unless there was an emergency or scheduled maintenance. I asked if the empty unit next door had any shared access with mine. He looked at me strangely. Then he said no, before he left. I asked him about the coat closet. He opened it, looked inside, and pressed on the back panel. It's probably just covering pipes, he said. He did not remove it. He told me if I was worried, I could use the chain lock at night. I did not like that answer. That evening I bought another deadbolt, a better one this time. I replaced the lock again. I also bought a small rubber door wedge, the kind you shove under the door from the inside. For a few nights, I used both. Deadbolt locked, chain on, door wedge in place. Nothing happened, but I started sleeping lightly. Every sound from the hallway woke me up. Footsteps, doors closing, someone coughing, the elevator cable moving behind the wall. About a week after the second lock change, I found the door wedge pushed slightly away from the door in the morning, not far. Maybe 3 inches. The door was still closed. The deadbolt was still locked. The chain was still on. I stared at the wedge for a long time. It was possible I had kicked it when I got up in the night. It was possible it had slipped on the floor, but the angle was wrong. It had moved away from the door toward the living room. I did not go to work that day. I called the landlord again. This time I was less polite. I told him someone was entering my apartment or trying to. He said he would come by himself. He arrived around noon with Rick. They checked the lock again. They checked the hallway. They checked the empty unit next door. They came back and told me they did not find anything. The landlord suggested I might be sleepwalking. I told him I had never sleepwalked in my life. He shrugged in that careful way people do when they have decided you are being unreasonable, but do not want to say it directly. That night, I did something simple. I pushed one of my kitchen chairs under the front doorknob before bed. It was not a perfect barricade. The floor was hardwood and the chair legs could slide. But the back of the chair fit under the knob at an angle, and I figured if the door opened even a little, it would make noise. I locked the deadbolt. I put on the chain. I wedged the chair under the knob. Then I stood in the living room and looked at the coat closet. I almost put something in front of that too, but I told myself I was letting my imagination take over. I went to bed around 11. For the first few hours I slept. Then I woke up to a sound, not from the front door. From the kitchen, it was very quiet. A small, careful sound, like the soft contact of something being set down on a counter. I did not move at first. My bedroom door was open about 6 inches. From my bed, I could see a thin slice of the hallway and a little bit of the living room beyond it. The apartment was dark except for the weak orange light from the parking lot coming through the blinds. I heard another sound, a cabinet hinge, slow and controlled. Someone was in my kitchen. I remember holding my breath, not because I wanted to, but because my body just stopped doing anything normally. I kept thinking of the front door, the chair, the chain, the deadbolt. Then I heard a soft footstep on the kitchen floor. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I was careful, but my hand was shaking enough that the charging cord tapped against the wood. The sound was tiny, but whoever was in the kitchen heard it. Everything stopped. For maybe 5 seconds, neither of us moved. Then I heard quick movement. Not running, just fast, controlled steps across the living room. I sat up and said, "Who's there?" My voice came out flat and weak. The movement stopped near the front door. I expected the chair to scrape. I expected the chain to rattle. Instead, I heard the coat closet door open. That sound is hard to explain if you do not know your own apartment. But when you live alone long enough, every door sounds different. The coat closet had a hollow, cheap sound. It always stuck slightly at the bottom. I heard it open, then I heard fabric move, coats brushing together. I got out of bed. I had my phone in my hand now, but I had not called anyone yet. I do not know why. Fear does not always make you do the obvious thing. I stepped into the hallway. From there I could see the front door. The chair was still wedged under the knob. The chain was still on, the deadbolt was locked. The coat closet door was open, maybe halfway. I turned on the hallway light. The closet was empty. At first, it looked empty. My coats were pushed to one side. The vacuum was tilted. The plastic bin had been moved, and the back panel was not flat anymore. One edge of it was sticking out, only by a few inches. There was a black gap behind it. I backed away and called 911. I told the dispatcher someone had been in my apartment and had gone into the wall. Saying it out loud made me sound insane. The dispatcher asked if I was safe. I said I did not know. She told me to leave the apartment if I could do so safely. The front door was still barricaded by the chair I had put there, so I moved it, undid the chain, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped into the hallway. I stood outside my own apartment in socks and a t-shirt, holding my phone, watching the open doorway. Mrs. Alvarez opened her door across the hall. She looked at me and then passed me into my apartment. I told her to go back inside and lock her door. She did. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 officers came up first. A third arrived not long after. They checked the apartment with flashlights. When they got to the coat closet, one of them pulled the panel open. It did not break. It just swung inward. It had been cut loose along one side but painted over so that, from inside the closet, it still looked like a fixed wall. Behind it was a narrow utility space. Not a room exactly. More like a shaft that ran behind the apartments. There were pipes, wiring, insulation, and wooden supports. There was enough space for a person to crouch and move sideways if they were patient. One officer shined his light inside and said something I could not hear. Then he told the others not to touch anything. They found dust disturbed on the plywood ledge behind the wall, not just near my closet but farther along. There were handprints, shoe prints, smears where someone had crawled or dragged themselves through. The officer asked if I knew where that space led. I said no. Rick from maintenance was called in after midnight. He looked nervous when he arrived. He said the utility spaces ran behind the units and connected to access panels near the hallway ceiling. They were supposed to be sealed. Some of them had been opened years ago during plumbing work. He said they were too narrow to be useful for anything. The officer asked him if a person could move through them. Rick did not answer right away. Then he said, a small person maybe, or someone who really wanted to. They opened the hallway utility panel near the ceiling outside the empty unit next door. The screws were missing. The panel had been resting in place. Inside they found more dust disturbed, more prints. Not fresh in the way footprints in mud are fresh, but clear enough to show someone had been moving through there more than once. Police checked the vacant unit next to mine. They found the closet panel in that unit had also been loosened. Then they checked Mrs. Alvarez's unit, with her permission. Her panel was intact, but there were scrape marks on the inside of it. That was the part that made her sit down in the hallway and cry. They checked the unit below mine the next morning, then the one below that. By the end of the day, the landlord had workers opening panels in several apartments. The police found shoe prints in the dust above multiple units, not just mine. They were in the shared utility spaces, above closets, behind bathroom walls, and over the drop ceiling in the laundry room. The pattern suggested someone had been moving between units for weeks. Maybe longer. They found a small backpack in the utility space above the laundry room. Inside were a flashlight, gloves, a bottle of water, a screwdriver, a folded towel, and several keys. Some were labeled with apartment numbers. Some were not. There were also small items that looked unimportant unless they belonged to you. A phone charger, a hair clip, a grocery store receipt, a child's toy car, a silver ring. Nothing expensive. Nothing that would make someone call the police immediately if it went missing. The officers asked me to look through the items. I recognized one thing. A blue lighter I kept in my kitchen drawer for candles. I had not noticed it was gone. They asked if I had ever seen anyone suspicious in the building. I said no. Then I remembered something. About a month earlier I had come home from work and seen a man standing near the stairwell on the second floor. He was not doing anything obvious, just standing there, looking at his phone. He wore a gray hoodie and work pants. I assumed he was visiting someone. When I passed him, he did not look at me. At the time, I barely registered him. I told the police. They wrote it down. That was the only description I could give. A man, average height, gray hoodie, work pants. That describes half the people who come through an apartment building. They check security cameras, but our building only had one by the front entrance and one in the parking lot. Both were old. The footage was grainy, and the landlord admitted one of them had not been recording consistently. They never told me they identified anyone. For the next week, police came and went from the building. Maintenance sealed panels. The landlord installed new screws, new locks, new strike plates, and door chains on every unit. A few tenants moved out immediately. I tried to stay. I told myself it was over. Whoever had been doing it knew the police were involved now. They would not come back. But the apartment felt different. The silence was different. The kitchen was the worst part. I kept thinking about how long the person had been standing there before I woke up. Whether they had been eating something, whether they had been looking through drawers, whether they had stood in my bedroom doorway on other nights. Because the truth was, I did not know. The deadbolt had been unlocked more than once. The wedge had been moved. The closet had smelled like dust and cold air. There may have been nights when someone came in, looked around, and left while I slept 10 feet away. That is the part I still have trouble with. Not what happened when I woke up, what happened when I did not. A detective called me about 2 weeks later and asked a few more questions. He said they were looking into former tenants, contractors, maintenance workers, and anyone who might have had access to keys or knowledge of the building layout. I asked if they thought it was someone living in the building. He paused before answering, then he said, "It's possible." That was all. I moved out before the end of the month. I lost my deposit because I broke the lease, but I did not care. On my last day there, I went through the apartment one room at a time, checking cabinets and outlets and vents, even though workers had already sealed everything. When I got to the coat closet, I stood there for a while. The panel had been replaced with thicker plywood and fastened with screws. The edges were caulked. It looked solid, but I still did not want to turn my back to it. As I was carrying my last box out, Mrs. Alvarez opened her door. She told me she was leaving too. Her daughter had found her a place closer to family. She looked tired. Before I went downstairs, she said something I think about more often than I want to. She said, "I keep wondering how many times he was in here." I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. It has been almost 3 years now. I live in a different apartment, in a newer building. 3rd floor. No interior utility closets. No shared wall panels that I can see. I asked about that before I signed the lease, and the leasing agent looked at me like it was a strange question. Every night, I lock the deadbolt. Then I check it again. I also use a door bar now. It wedges under the knob and braces against the floor. I know it would not stop everything, but it helps me sleep, most nights anyway. Every once in a while, I wake up before my alarm for no clear reason. The room is dark. The apartment is quiet. And for a few seconds before I remember where I am, I listen for the sound of a cabinet hinge or careful footsteps, or coats brushing together in the dark. My wife and I moved into the apartment in March of 2021. At the time, our daughter was 4 months old and we were desperate for more space. Before that, we had been living in a one-bedroom on the other side of town, with the crib wedged between our bed and the closet. Every night felt like a careful operation. If one of us rolled over too loudly, she woke up. If I got up early for work, she woke up. If the neighbor upstairs walked across the floor, she woke up. So when we found the two-bedroom apartment on Hawthorne, it felt like we had gotten lucky. It was in an older building, but it had been recently renovated. New floors, new cabinets, new appliances, fresh paint. The listing described it as a historic building with modern updates, which usually means someone painted over problems instead of fixing them, but we were tired and not in a position to be picky. The rent was a little higher than we wanted, but still manageable. It had an elevator, laundry in the basement, and a strict no-smoking policy, which mattered to us because our daughter had been born a little early and had some breathing issues in the beginning. Nothing serious by then, but enough that we were careful. The building manager, a woman named Carla, made a point of telling us smoking was not allowed anywhere inside, not in the units, not in the halls, not even near the front entrance. She said it like she had said it 100 times before. We signed the lease 3 days later. Our unit was on the 4th floor, at the end of a hallway. Apartment 4D. It was quiet. That was one of the things we liked most. There was only one unit directly next to us, 4C, and the other side of our apartment bordered the stairwell, and what we were told was an old service chase. The building had once had some kind of dumbwaiter or maintenance shaft, but during the renovation it had been sealed off. At least that was what we were told. We put our daughter's nursery in the smaller bedroom. It was a simple room, a crib, a dresser, a rocking chair near the window, some shelves with books she was too young to understand. My wife painted little white clouds on one wall, and we put a small sound machine on the dresser. That room became the quietest place in the apartment. For the first month, everything was fine. There were the normal sounds of an old building, pipes clicking, floorboards above us, the elevator groaning at night. Sometimes we heard someone in the stairwell, especially on weekends, but it never bothered us. Then one night, maybe 5 or 6 weeks after we moved in, my wife came out of the nursery and asked if I smelled smoke. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop open, trying to answer work emails. I remember looking up at her and saying, "Like from outside?" she said. "No, in her room." I went in and smelled it immediately. It wasn't strong, not at first. It was just a stale cigarette smell. Like someone had smoked in a car and then rolled the windows down. Faint, but very specific. The window in the nursery was shut. It was still cold out, and we had not opened it all week. I checked the hallway, nothing. I checked our bedroom, nothing. The smell seemed to be concentrated near the corner by the crib, along the wall we shared with the sealed service shaft. Our daughter was asleep, and I didn't want to wake her, so I just stood there quietly, leaning down near the baseboard. That was where it seemed strongest. I told my wife it was probably old smoke trapped in the walls from before the renovation. Maybe the heat had kicked on and stirred something up. She didn't look convinced, but she was tired, and so was I. We opened the nursery door and let the air circulate. By morning, the smell was gone. 2 nights later, it came back. This time it was stronger. My wife noticed it during a feeding around midnight. She came into our room holding the baby, and I could tell from her face that something was wrong. I sat up, and she said very quietly, "It's smoke again." I went into the nursery. The smell was not just stale this time. It was fresh, not like someone had smoked there an hour ago, like someone had smoked recently. I checked the window again, locked. I checked the hallway again, nothing. Then I went out into the stairwell. The stairwell was empty. It smelled like dust and old concrete, but not cigarettes. When I came back in, my wife was standing in the nursery doorway, bouncing our daughter against her shoulder. She said, "I don't want her sleeping in there." So we moved the bassinet back into our room that night. The next morning, I called the management office. Carla answered. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her we had smelled cigarette smoke in the nursery twice, that our windows were closed, and that we were concerned because we had an infant. She sounded annoyed, but not with me exactly. She said they had been having trouble with people smoking on the back fire escape, even though it was against policy, She said the smell could be coming through vents or cracks. I told her it seemed to be coming from a specific wall. She said she would send an email reminding tenants of the no smoking rule. That afternoon, everyone in the building got a notice taped to their doors. No smoking inside the building or within 25 feet of entrances. We felt better for a few days. Then it happened again. This time it was during the day. It was a Saturday, around 3 in the afternoon. My wife was in the nursery putting clothes away, and I was in the kitchen. She called my name. Not loudly, just in a way that made me stop what I was doing. I went in, and the smell was there. It was so fresh that I instinctively looked around for a lit cigarette. There was nothing. No smoke in the air, no haze, just the smell. My wife was standing near the dresser with a onesie in her hand. She said, "This is not from outside." I got down on the floor and smelled along the baseboard again. It was strongest in the same spot. A section of baseboard on the wall behind the rocking chair looked slightly uneven. Not enough that I would have noticed it before, but when I pressed it with my thumb, it moved a little. I didn't pull it off. I wish now that I had. Instead, I took a video on my phone. Not because I thought it would show anything, but because I wanted proof of the time and the room. I recorded myself saying the date and describing the smell. It felt stupid while I was doing it. Then I called maintenance. The maintenance man, Edwin, came up about an hour later. He was probably in his late 50s, with gray hair and a soft voice. He had been working in the building for a long time, from what he told me. He stood in the nursery for a while without saying anything. By then, the smell had faded. I could tell he didn't really smell it anymore, and I felt embarrassed. He checked the window seal. He looked at the vent. He opened the closet. He tapped the wall near the baseboard. Then he said, "Old buildings breathe in weird ways." I asked him what was behind that wall. He said, "Nothing now. Used to be a service shaft." I asked if it could be opened somewhere. He said it should not be. He said during the renovation most of those voids had been sealed, but he admitted there were probably spaces between walls that nobody had looked at in years. He told us he would check the apartments above and below us and see if anyone had been reported for smoking before he left. My wife asked if there was any way someone could be smoking inside the service shaft. Edwin looked at her for a moment. Then he said no. Not unless they can walk through walls. He meant it as a joke. None of us laughed. For the next week, we kept our daughter in our room. The nursery became more like a storage room. We still changed her in there during the day, but we didn't let her sleep there. I started checking the room every night before bed. I would stand in the dark and listen. I don't know what I expected to hear. Usually there was nothing. Just the sound machine, if it was on, and the low hum of the building. But once, I heard something that sounded like a faint scrape. It came from the wall behind the rocking chair. I stood there holding my breath. It happened again. A small, dry sound, like fingernails on painted wood. I turned on the lamp and moved the rocking chair aside. There was nothing there. The baseboard still looked slightly uneven. I pressed it again, and it shifted. This time I told my wife. She wanted to call management immediately, but it was almost 1 in the morning. I told her I would email them and include the video. I wrote a long email. I tried not to sound dramatic. I described the smoke smell, the location, the loose baseboard, and the sound from the wall. I asked them to inspect the sealed service shaft. Carla responded the next morning. Her email was short. She said maintenance had already checked the area and found no active issue. She suggested we purchase an air purifier if the odor persisted. That was the first time I got angry. I wrote back and said we were not complaining about an odor. We were reporting cigarette smoke in a baby's room in a non-smoking building. I also mentioned our daughter's breathing history. That got a response. Carla called me within 15 minutes and said Edwin would come back with another maintenance worker and look again. They came the following Tuesday. Edwin brought a younger guy with him. I don't remember his name. They had a ladder, a flashlight, and a few tools. They checked the hallway first, then the stairwell. Then they came into the nursery. I showed them the baseboard. Edwin knelt down and pressed on it. It moved more than it had for me. He frowned. The younger guy said, "That shouldn't do that." They asked if they could pull it back. I said yes. My wife took the baby into the living room. I stayed in the doorway. Edwin used a small pry bar and worked the baseboard loose carefully. It came away from the wall with a soft cracking sound. Behind it was a narrow horizontal gap between the drywall and the floor. At first there was nothing obvious, just dust and old plaster. Then Edwin shined his flashlight into the gap and stopped moving. The younger guy leaned in beside him. Neither of them said anything. I asked, "What is it?" Edwin said, "Can you step back for a second?" That scared me more than if he had just answered. He reached into the gap with pliers and pulled something out. It was a cigarette butt, not ancient, not yellowed and dry. It was used, but it looked recent. He set it on a paper towel from the dresser. Then he pulled out another, then another. By the time he was done, there were 7 cigarette butts on the paper towel. My wife had come back to the doorway by then, holding our daughter against her chest. She whispered, "Oh my God." The younger maintenance guy went downstairs to get something. Edwin stayed kneeling in front of the wall, looking pale. He told us there was a cavity behind the drywall. He could feel air moving through it. He said they needed to open the wall. I asked if they had to do it right then. He said yes. Carla arrived about 10 minutes later. She looked irritated when she came in, like she expected to calm down a difficult tenant. Then she saw the cigarette butts. Her face changed. She told us they were going to move us to another unit temporarily while they inspected the wall. There was an empty one on the second floor. I asked what they thought was going on. No one answered directly. They moved the crib and some baby things downstairs that afternoon. I stayed upstairs while Edwin and the other guy cut into the nursery wall. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe I felt like if I left, I would never get a straight answer. They cut a square section of drywall near the baseboard, behind where the rocking chair had been. When they pulled the piece away, there was a dark space behind it. It was not large, maybe 2 feet wide. It ran vertically through the building. An old service shaft, not sealed, not completely. There were pipes in it, and old wood framing, and a lot of dust. It smelled like old insulation and cigarettes. Edwin shined his flashlight inside. The beam caught on something metallic near the bottom. He reached in and pulled out a small flashlight, one of those cheap black ones you keep in a junk drawer. The batteries still worked. He clicked it on by accident, and the beam hit the floor. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then the younger guy said, "Ed." His voice was tight. He was pointing at the inside of the drywall section they had removed. There was a small hole through it, not a clean drilled hole, more like someone had scraped at the backside with a nail or a screw. It was just above the height of the baseboard. From inside the room it had been hidden behind the loose wood trim. From inside the shaft it would have looked directly into the nursery, low but angled upward, toward the crib. My wife made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a scream, not crying, just this small, flat sound, like all the air had left her body. I walked over and looked at the wall. I wish I hadn't. The hole was small, but it was definitely intentional. Around it, the back of the drywall was scratched and worn, like someone had adjusted it over time to see better. I thought about all the nights I had stood in that room in the dark, all the feedings, all the times my wife had sat in the rocking chair with her shirt pulled down, half asleep, holding our daughter, all the times we thought the smell was coming from nowhere. Carla told everyone to stop touching things. Then she called the police. The officers who came were polite, but I could tell they were not sure what to do with it at first. There was no one in the shaft. No clear sign of forced entry into our apartment. The cigarette butts were bagged. The flashlight was bagged. They took photos of the hole, the wall, the nursery, the baseboard. They asked if we had any enemies. I said no. They asked if we had argued with any neighbors. No. They asked if we had noticed anyone in the hall. Not really. That was the hard part. In an apartment building, you pass people without remembering them. A man getting into the elevator, someone holding laundry, a person with a hood up leaving through the side door. None of it seems important until later. The police inspected the service shaft from the basement and the roof. From what they told us, parts of it had been sealed during the renovation, but not all of it. There were access panels and utility closets on some floors. A few had been painted shut. One in the basement had a latch that did not lock properly. Someone could get into the shaft from there. It would not have been comfortable. It was narrow and dirty. But a person could fit if they were willing to crawl and climb. The officer said there was dust disturbed on some of the ledges inside. He said they found shoe prints, but nothing useful. The building manager kept apologizing. At first, the apologies sounded like things she thought she was supposed to say. Then, after the police left, she asked if she could speak to me privately in the hallway. My wife was downstairs with the baby in the temporary unit. I stood with Carla outside 4D while Edwin replaced the lock. Carla looked exhausted. She said, "There's something I need to tell you." I waited. She said the previous tenant in our unit had left before the end of her lease. A woman, late 20s, lived alone. Carla said the woman had complained about cigarette smoke too, several times. I felt a cold pressure in my chest when she said that. I asked what they had done. Carla looked down the hallway and said they had checked vents, sent notices, and offered to have the unit cleaned. The tenant eventually moved out suddenly. No formal complaint. No police report. She just packed and left one weekend. Carla said they thought she was being sensitive, or maybe using it as a reason to break the lease. I asked if she had mentioned the nursery wall. Carla said no. Then she corrected herself. She said it had been an office back then, not a nursery. I asked if the tenant ever said she felt watched. Carla didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. I asked for the tenant's name. She said she couldn't give it to me. I said someone had been inside the wall of my daughter's room. She said she understood. I said no, she didn't. We moved out 3 days later. We broke the lease. I don't know if management would have fought us on it under normal circumstances, but after what happened, they didn't. We stayed with my wife's parents for 6 weeks while we found another place. For a while, my wife barely slept. She would wake up and check the corners of rooms. She checked behind furniture. She checked vents and closets and attic doors in houses we toured. I did too, although I tried not to let her see it. The police called twice after that. The first time, they said the cigarette butts had no useful fingerprints. They had possible DNA, but there was no match to anything in the system. The second time, they said they had interviewed several tenants and contractors who had worked on the renovation. Nothing came of it. They did not find the person. The building installed new locks on the basement access panels and, from what I heard, opened up more of the shaft to seal it properly. But by then, we were gone. A few months later, I received a message on Facebook from a woman I didn't know. Her name was Emily. She asked if I had lived in apartment 4D on Hawthorne. I almost deleted the message. Then I saw that she had mutual friends with a local moms group my wife had joined. I replied and said yes. She asked if we had moved because of smoke. I felt sick reading that. I asked if she was the previous tenant. She said yes. We ended up speaking on the phone that night. She had lived in 4D for about 8 months before us. She used the smaller bedroom as a home office. She said the cigarette smell started about 3 months after she moved in. Always in that room. Always near the same wall. At first she thought it was coming from a neighbor. Then she started hearing small noises in the wall, scraping, shuffling. Once, what sounded like a cough. She reported it over and over. Maintenance came up a few times and told her old buildings carried smells. Then one night, she was working late at her desk with headphones on. She got up to close her laptop and saw a tiny point of light near the floor. She thought it was a reflection. Then it moved. She said it disappeared before she could get close. The next morning, she found a small pile of gray dust along the baseboard. She left that weekend. She never told management about the light because she thought they would say she was imagining it. She was living alone, and she said by then she just wanted to get out. I asked if she had ever seen anyone. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "Not clearly." I asked what that meant. She said there was a man she noticed in the building more than once, but she didn't know if he lived there. Maybe 40s. Maybe older, thin. Wore a dark baseball cap most of the time. She saw him in the laundry room once when she went down late at night. He wasn't doing laundry. He was just standing near the utility closet. When she walked in, he smiled and said he was waiting for someone. She left without doing her clothes. She said she told herself afterward that she had overreacted. I asked if she remembered anything else about him. She said he smelled like cigarettes. That was all. I gave the police her information. I don't know if anything happened with it. Probably not. I still think about the timeline more than I should. The person had been there before us. Maybe long before us. He knew the layout of the building. He knew which access panels opened. He knew which walls were hollow. He knew how to get close enough to look into a room without entering the apartment. The cigarette smoke was the only reason we found out. If he had not smoked in there, we might never have known. That is the part that stays with me. Not the hole, not the flashlight, not even the thought of someone watching my daughter's crib. It is the idea that he was careless only because he felt safe. He had probably done it before. He probably knew complaints would be dismissed as smells traveling through vents. He probably knew people in apartments get used to odd noises. Pipes knock, walls creak, neighbors smoke. Old buildings breathe. After we moved into our new place, I went through every room with a flashlight. I checked behind baseboards, behind vents, inside closets, under sinks. I tapped on walls until my knuckles hurt. My wife asked me to stop because it was scaring her. I did stop, at least when she was around. Our daughter is older now. She is fine. She does not remember that apartment. Sometimes when I'm putting her to bed, she asks me to leave the door open a little. Most kids do that. It is normal. But every time I look at the wall behind her bed before I leave the room, I look at the baseboard. I look for gaps. I know that sounds paranoid. I used to think the same thing about people who checked hotel rooms or covered peepholes or pushed chairs under doorknobs. I understand it now. There are some things that do not feel real until they happen in a quiet room, in a normal building, on a normal night, and afterward, the world does not look dangerous exactly. It just looks thinner, like there are spaces behind everything, like some walls are only walls because no one has decided to open them yet. I moved into the apartment in March 2 years ago. It was a fourth-floor walk-up in a pre-war building on the north side of the city. Nothing special. Narrow hallways. Old tile in the entry. Radiators that knocked at night. Paint layered so thick on the doors that they didn't quite close unless you pulled hard. The rent was low for the area, which was the only reason I took it. I was 29 at the time. I worked in billing at a medical office, and I had just ended a long relationship. I didn't have much furniture. I didn't have much money. I wanted a place where I could be alone and not think too much. The apartment was small. A bedroom, a living room, a bathroom, and a kitchen that had probably been renovated in the late 80s and not touched since. The kitchen cabinets were cheap white laminate, yellowed around the handles. Under the sink, there was a dark cabinet with exposed plumbing. The bottom was warped from old leaks, and there was a rectangular panel on the left wall of the cabinet that looked like it had been painted over a dozen times. I remember noticing it during the walkthrough. I asked the property manager about it. He said, "That's just access for the pipes." Then he moved on. At the time, I didn't care. The building was old. Everything had an explanation like that. For the first few weeks, I liked living there. It was quiet most nights. The guy below me played jazz sometimes, but never late. There was an older woman on the second floor who burned incense that drifted into the stairwell. Across the hall from me was a young couple with a baby, and I could hear them carrying the stroller up and down the stairs every morning. The apartment to my right was empty. It shared my kitchen wall, and maybe part of my living room wall. I only knew because our doors were next to each other in the hallway. Unit 4B. Mine was 4A. When I moved in, there was a paper sign taped to 4B's door that said, "Do not show, repairs pending." The sign stayed there for months. I asked about it once when I dropped off my rent check. The property manager said the previous tenant had left suddenly, and there were issues with the unit. He didn't go into detail. I didn't ask. The first time I heard the vibration, I thought it was my own phone. It was just after midnight. I was in bed, almost asleep, when I heard that low buzzing sound. Not a ringtone, not a beep, Just a phone vibrating against a hard surface. Bizz. Pause. Bizz. Pause. It was faint, but clear enough that I sat up. My phone was charging on the crate I used as a nightstand. The screen was dark. I picked it up anyway. No calls, no alarms, no notifications. The buzzing had stopped. I sat there for maybe a minute, listening. Nothing. I figured it had come from another apartment. Old buildings carry sound strangely. Sometimes it sounded like someone was walking above me, even though I was on the top floor. Sometimes voices came through the radiator pipes. I went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again, just after midnight. This time I was still awake, sitting on the couch, watching a show on my laptop. I had one earbud in. I heard it under the audio. Bizz. Pause. Bzzz. I muted the show. The sound stopped. I walked around the living room with my own phone in my hand, shining the flashlight under the couch, behind the TV stand, inside the basket where I kept blankets. Nothing. I checked my purse. Nothing. I checked the pockets of the jacket hanging by the door, even though I knew there was nothing in them. I stood very still in the middle of the apartment. I didn't hear it again. The next morning I told myself it was probably my downstairs neighbor's phone on a table, but on the third night I heard it from the kitchen. I was brushing my teeth when it started. Bizz. Pause. Bizzes. It wasn't loud. That was the worst part. If it had been loud, I could have found it. This was quiet, muffling through something, like a phone inside a drawer or under a stack of towels. I rinsed my mouth and went into the kitchen. The sound was already fading. I opened the junk drawer. I opened the silverware drawer. I opened every cabinet. I checked inside a mixing bowl I never used. I moved the bags under the sink. I even opened the oven, which sounds stupid now, but in the moment I just wanted to locate it. The buzzing stopped before I found anything. After that, it became a pattern, not every single night, but most nights, always between midnight and 12:15. Never earlier, never in the morning, never during the day. It would start buzz maybe 3 or 4 times, then stop. Sometimes I heard it from the living room. Sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes I couldn't tell where it came from at all. I started keeping track in my notes app. March 28, 12:08. March 29, 12:03. March 31, 12:11. April 20, 12:06. I wrote down where I was standing, how many buzzes, and where I thought it came from. That made me feel like I was doing something practical. It didn't make me feel better. I started searching the apartment in daylight. I pulled out the couch. I shook out the cushions. I emptied the kitchen drawers and put everything back one by one. I looked inside the vents, which were just old metal grates painted white. I unscrewed one in the living room and found dust, 2 pennies, and a dead beetle. No phone. I checked the bedroom closet. I checked the bathroom vanity. I checked behind the refrigerator as much as I could without disconnecting it. I told my brother about it after a couple of weeks. His name is David. He's 3 years older than me and works maintenance for a school district. Not a contractor exactly, but he knows enough about old buildings to be useful. He laughed at first. Not in a mean way, he said. You probably have some old alarm clock in the wall. I told him it sounded like a phone. He said phones don't vibrate for weeks if they're dead. I said, I know. He said, then it's not a phone. That was the logical answer. I wanted to believe it, but the sound was a phone. Anyone who has lived with a phone on vibrate knows that sound. The little motor, the rhythm, the way it changes depending on what it's resting against. This sounded like a phone vibrating inside something hollow. Around that time, I also started noticing small things. I don't want to make them sound bigger than they were. They were not dramatic. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing that I could prove, but I would come home and feel like the apartment had been slightly rearranged. A dish towel hanging lower than I remembered. The bathroom door partly closed when I usually left it open. The chain lock lying against the door in a different position. Once, I found the cabinet under the sink not fully closed. I told myself I must have left it that way. I had been going through it more often because of the noise, Another time, I came home from work and smelled something sweet and artificial in the kitchen, like fruit candy. I didn't own anything like that. The smell was faint and gone by the next morning. I started taking pictures before I left for work. Not of everything, just the front door, the kitchen, the sink cabinet, the living room. I felt embarrassed doing it, like I was encouraging myself to become paranoid. But I still did it. Most days, nothing changed. Then one Thursday in April, I got home around 6 and saw that the sponge on my sink had moved. In the morning picture, it was on the right side of the faucet. When I got home, it was on the left. That was it. Just a sponge. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at it. I did not call the police. What was I going to say? Someone moved my sponge? Instead, I checked the lock. I checked the windows. I checked the closet. I opened the shower curtain. Then I sat on the couch with my shoes still on until almost 10. At 12:07, the buzzing started. This time I was ready. I had turned everything off. No laptop. No fan. No refrigerator hum, because I had unplugged it for a few minutes. The apartment was as quiet as I could make it. When the buzzing started, I was standing in the kitchen. Bzzz. Pause. Bzzz. It was coming from under the sink. I'm sure of that. I dropped to my knees and opened the cabinet. There were cleaning supplies, trash bags, a roll of paper towels, and the pipes going back into the wall. Bzzz. The sound came from the left side, from behind the painted panel. I put my hand on it. The panel was vibrating slightly, then it stopped. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning, I called the property manager. I told him I thought there might be an old phone or alarm device behind the sink cabinet. He sounded annoyed. He asked if there was water leaking. I said no. He said if it wasn't an emergency, he could put in a maintenance request. I asked when someone could come. He said probably next week. I asked if he had a key to 4B. He paused. Then he said, "Why would you need access to 4B?" I told him I didn't need access. I said the panel under my sink might connect to that unit. He said it probably didn't. Then he said again that he would put in a maintenance request. Nobody came the next week. The buzzing continued. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom and started sleeping on the couch, closer to the kitchen. I kept a chair wedged under the front doorknob, even though the door opened inward and I knew it wasn't a real solution. I bought a cheap door alarm that stuck to the frame with adhesive. I also bought a small camera, not an expensive system, just one of those little indoor cameras people use to check on pets. I set it on the bookshelf facing the kitchen and front door. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third day, the camera went offline while I was at work. I checked the app around lunch, like I had been doing. It said the camera was disconnected. I assumed the Wi-Fi had gone out. When I got home, the camera was still sitting on the shelf, but it had been turned toward the wall. The power cord was still plugged in. I remember standing in the doorway and not moving. My keys were in my hand. My work bag was on my shoulder. I looked at the camera facing the wall, and then I looked at the kitchen. The sink cabinet was closed. The sponge was where I had left it. Nothing else looked different. I backed out into the hallway and called my brother. I told him he needed to come over. He asked what happened. I said, "Someone moved the camera." He got quiet. Then he said he was on his way. I waited in the hallway until he arrived. It took him about 40 minutes. A neighbor came up the stairs during that time. The older woman from the second floor. She asked if I was locked out. I said no, just waiting for my brother. She looked at my door, then at 4B. She said, "They still haven't fixed that one." I asked her what was wrong with it. She shrugged and said there had been trouble with the last man who lived there. I asked what kind of trouble. She said she didn't know, but police came one night, and after that he was gone. Then she went downstairs. When David arrived, he brought a flashlight, a screwdriver, a pry bar, and the expression he gets when he's trying not to scare me. He checked the front door first. No scratches around the lock. No damage. Then he checked the windows. They were locked from the inside, and we were on the 4th floor anyway. He looked at the camera. He asked if I was sure I hadn't moved it. I said yes. He didn't argue. We went into the kitchen. I opened the sink cabinet and pointed at the painted panel on the left side. David crouched down and pressed on it. It shifted, not much, but enough. He looked at me and said, "This isn't secured." He took the cleaning supplies out and set them on the floor. Then he used the screwdriver to scrape along the edge of the panel. Paint flaked off in thick strips. There were 2 screws, but one was missing and the other was barely holding. He backed the screw out, then pulled on the panel. It resisted for a second. Then it came loose. Behind it was not a wall. It was a dark cavity. A space between the cabinets and the plumbing chase. It was bigger than I expected. Maybe 2 feet wide, maybe 3 feet deep, with pipes running through it. There was dust and old insulation and a jagged opening in the far side where the plumbing continued into the apartment next door. Unit 4B. David shined his flashlight in. Neither of us spoke at first. There were candy wrappers in the back, granola bar wrappers, a crushed water bottle, a small plastic bag from a corner store, and a folded dark jacket. Not old building debris, not left by workers years ago. Recent things, human things. David said, very quietly, "Go wait in the hall." I didn't move. He turned and looked at me. "Seriously, go wait in the hall." I stepped back, but I didn't leave. He reached into the cavity with the pry bar and dragged the jacket forward. It was a men's jacket, navy blue. One sleeve was tucked inside itself. Under it was a phone. A black smartphone with a cracked screen. No case. It was face down on a piece of cardboard, set back near the pipe opening. David picked it up carefully, like it might bite him. The screen lit when he pressed the side button. That was the first thing that made my stomach drop. It still had power, only 9%, but it was on. There was no service, no SIM card, or maybe no active plan. The date was wrong by a few days, but the time was close. The phone was locked with a pin. On the lock screen there were no notifications, just the time and the battery. David swiped up and tried to access it, but of course he couldn't. Then the alarm screen appeared. He must have accidentally touched something. I saw the word alarm at the top. There were multiple alarms listed: 12:05 a.m., 12:09 a.m., 12:13 a.m., all set to vibrate only. Then more: 7:10 a.m., 7:35 a.m., 7:50 a.m., also set to vibrate. Those were the times I usually left for work. Not exactly every day, but close enough. I had a routine. I woke up at 6:45. I showered. I made coffee. I usually left between 7:35 and 7:50, depending on how late I was running. The phone had alarms for those times. David looked at me. I remember his face more than anything. He wasn't confused anymore. He was angry. He told me to leave the apartment. This time I did. We called the police from the hallway. 2 officers came about 20 minutes later. Then a third. They looked under the sink. They looked at the phone. They looked at the wrappers and jacket. They called the property manager and made him come with the key to 4B. He arrived sweating, wearing sandals, acting irritated until the officers told him what they had found. Then he got quiet. I stood in the hallway while they opened 4B. The smell came out first. Not a death smell, not anything like that. Just stale air, dust, old cigarettes, and something damp. The apartment had no furniture. There were drop cloths on the floor, a few paint cans, and a ladder in the living room. The kitchen cabinets had been partly removed. Under the sink, there was a matching access area where the wall had been opened. From that side, a person could reach into the plumbing space between the units. The opening into my cabinet wasn't large enough for a grown adult to crawl fully into my apartment. That is what the police said later, but it was large enough for someone to reach an arm through, large enough to move something, large enough to open the loose panel from the inside if the cabinet wasn't blocked, large enough to listen. The officers asked me a lot of questions. Had I noticed missing clothing? Had anyone been inside my apartment? Had I seen anyone in the hallway? Did I know the previous tenant? Had I had problems with an ex-boyfriend? Had I posted my address anywhere? The answer was no to almost everything. I told them about the buzzing. I told them about the sponge. I told them about the camera. I showed them the pictures I had taken every morning. Most of them were useless, but one showed the sink cabinet slightly open when I left for work. Another showed it closed when I came home, or maybe the other way around. I don't remember now. The police took the phone. They took the jacket and the wrappers. They dusted the cabinet for prints, though one officer warned me that there would probably be too many to make anything useful. Mine, maintenance workers, previous tenants, anyone. They asked the property manager who had access to 4B. He said maintenance, him, and the owner. Then he admitted that contractors had been in and out months earlier. He also admitted the lock on 4B had not been changed after the previous tenant left. David nearly lost it when he heard that. The property manager kept saying nobody was living there. One of the officers said, "Someone was using it." That sentence has stayed with me. Someone was using it, not living there exactly, not officially, using it. Using the empty apartment, using the access panel, using the space between the walls. The police did not find anyone in 4B that night. They checked the closets, the bathroom, and the fire escape. The fire escape ladder was down to the 3rd floor, but nobody knew if it had been that way already. There were cigarette butts in the empty bedroom. There was a paper cup with dried coffee on the windowsill. There was a flattened cardboard box in the closet, like someone had been sitting on it, or sleeping there. The property manager said contractors must have left those things. The officers didn't seem convinced. I spent that night at David's house. The next day, I went back with him and 2 police officers to get clothes and my important papers. I didn't stay in the apartment again, not even one night. My lease was broken after a lot of arguing and one letter from a legal aid office. The property company gave me my deposit back, which I think they did mostly because they wanted me to stop calling. I moved into a smaller place farther from work, a basement unit in a house owned by a retired couple. Not perfect, but the door locked properly, and there were no shared walls with vacant apartments. For a while, I followed up with the police every couple of weeks. They told me the phone had no active service. They said it was old, wiped of most accounts, and the PIN had been difficult to get around. I never got a clear answer about whether they recovered anything useful from it. They never told me they arrested anyone. The previous tenant of 4B was apparently located and questioned. That is all I know. I do not know if it was him. I don't know if it was a contractor. I don't know if it was someone who found a way into the empty apartment and realized no one would check. The building had a rear entrance that didn't latch properly. I learned that later from the woman on the 2nd floor. She said everyone knew about it, everyone except me. I also learned that 4B had been vacant for nearly 8 months. The repairs were not urgent. The owner just didn't want to pay for them yet, so the unit sat empty, but not empty enough. That's the part I still think about. I try not to exaggerate what happened. Nobody jumped out at me. Nobody threatened me directly. I was not attacked, but someone had been close enough to hear me running water, close enough to know when I left in the morning, close enough to reach into my apartment while I was gone, maybe while I was asleep. And for weeks, every night after midnight, that phone vibrated in the wall. I used to wonder why. Why set alarms for just after midnight? Why not turn the phone off? Why leave it there at all? The best guess I have is that it was a signal. Maybe a reminder for whoever was on the other side. Maybe they were checking if I was asleep. Maybe they forgot it, and the battery kept going longer than they expected. Or maybe the phone was never meant to be found. I don't know. I don't like guessing anymore. There is one detail I haven't told many people because it sounds too neat. Too much like something added to make the story more frightening. But it happened. A few days after I moved out, David went back with me to return the keys. I wanted him there because I didn't want to be alone in that hallway again. The paper sign was still taped to 4B's door. Do not show. Repairs pending. My old door was open because maintenance had been inside. The sink cabinet was empty, and the panel was gone completely. You could see straight into the dark space behind the pipes. While David talked to the property manager in the hallway, I stood in the kitchen for maybe 30 seconds. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to make the place feel smaller before I left it. Less powerful. I looked at the cabinet, and I noticed fresh scratches on the wood around the opening. Not old scratches, new ones. Thin, pale marks in the yellowed laminate, like someone had tried to fit the panel back in after it had been removed, or like someone had reached through and dragged something out. I told David. He looked. Then he told me to go downstairs. I did. That was the last time I ever saw the apartment. A month later, I checked the rental listing out of curiosity. Unit 4A was posted online again. Same photos from before I lived there. Same rent, same description. Sunny one-bedroom in charming vintage building, quiet top-floor unit. Available immediately. There was no mention of the access panel. No mention of 4B. No mention of the empty apartment next door. I closed the page and tried not to think about who moved in after me. For a long time, I couldn't sleep if my phone was on vibrate. Even now, I keep it on silent across the room. No vibration, no buzzing. If an alarm goes off, it plays music. Something obvious. Something I can find. Because there are sounds that your brain can explain away for only so long. A pipe. A neighbor. A refrigerator. An old building settling. But sometimes a sound is exactly what it seems to be. Sometimes the phone really is inside the wall, and sometimes it was put there by someone who knew your routine better than they should have.